Vinoba Bhave was named by Mahatma Gandhi as his spiritual successor. And even though he was a very quiet and contemplative person who never wanted to be in the public eye or in the limelight, he became a hugely inspiring hero for many and made an impact on the Indian society and on the rest of the world through his efforts. On May 11, 1953, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine and also in the New Yorker and New York Times for the movement called Bodhan, the land gift. Vinoba's idea of the land gift movement was conceived 2 years earlier in 1951 while he was on a walking pilgrimage from village to village and persuading the rich landowners to donate 1/5 of their land to the poor, a group of landless untouchables, members of the lowest caste. He walked from village to village over all 70,000 kilometers, appealing for gifts of land to be distributed among the landless without any coercion, any compulsion, but just out of the spirit of generosity. When I heard this story, true story, my reaction was, no way. There is no way that this could have happened. But I learned that over 5 million acres of land had been donated. That's almost 3 times the size of Delaware. Vinoba walked and continued persuading landowners that out of kindness and justice for the poorest of the poor, they should give from generosity 1/5 of their land to these untouchables. The land reform and later entire villages, thousands of villages, were secured by a change of heart and not by government enforcement. This 5 million acres, which is just similar to the size of New Jersey or Massachusetts, became the largest peaceful transfer of land in human history. So I ask myself, what was the motivation? What was the inner working that resulted in such extraordinary action? I quote from Vinoba's biographer, Mark Shepard. Vinoba's daily routine was the same for a number of years. Vinoba and his company would rise by 3 a.m. and hold a prayer meeting for themselves. Then they would walk 10 to 12 miles to the next village every single day. Vinoba led at a pace that left the others just struggling breathlessly behind. There were no free weekends on this itinerary, no holidays, no days off. The man who led this relentless crusade was 57 years old. He suffered from chronic dysentery, chronic malaria, and an intestinal ulcer. And he restricted himself, because of his ulcer, to the diet of honey, milk, and yogurt only. Again, I ask, what do you think might have been the motivation of Vinoba, of his many followers, and eventually of the rich landowners as they invested themselves in such huge effort? I personally believe that they practiced acting justly, doing it because they loved mercy and out of kindness of their hearts for the have-nots, and that Vinoba indeed walked on foot over 40,000 miles humbly on the journey across India. Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. For the purposes of being brief this morning, I will not look at the larger context of this extraordinary text that many biblical scholars, theologians, and yes, ethicists regard as the pinnacle of the religious and moral thought. Talmud said that this verse, and I quote, "By virtue of its three principles of doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God, encapsulates the essence of 613 commandments communicated to Moses," end of quote. Two current biblical scholars describe this verse as rightly celebrated as the supreme definition of ethical religion. In 1897, Charles W. Eliot, president of Harvard University, chose the second part I want to focus on of Micah 6:8 to be inscribed about a statue symbolizing religion in the new Library of Congress building. In 1977, Jimmy Carter made it a focal point of his presidential inaugural address. So you might ask, what's all the fuss? What does the Lord actually require from us? God, what do you want? Having spent at least 18 years in school by now, some of you 20, you are aware of all the requirements in educational processes. Many of you looked in the syllabus first at the requirements as the bottom line of the course. What do I need to get an A in the best case scenario, you were asking? What does this professor really want? And now that you have completed your studies at Loma Linda University and are sitting deservedly congratulating yourself and each other, here I dare to bring to you larger requirements that your dental or pharmacy program PLOs have not asked for. Because our text starts with requirements. It asks, what does the Lord require of you? We have heard of ILOs and SLOs and PLOs, but here are now questions of the GLOs. We have heard of those institutional, school, and program learning outcomes that you have already achieved by now, because if you had not, you would not be sitting in your regalia in the front pews on this weekend. But that question still remains about GLOs, or God's learning outcomes. You and I, and in the text it says Adam, generically, you man, or better mankind, we mortals are reminded that God showed us what is good, what is the better way, what is truly moral, and what God requires in my and your life journey. And we are given what one commentator call a trilogy of spiritual qualities that are as social as they are personal in nature. The triad of a verb followed by a noun of Micah 6:8 are about lifestyle, one's total outlook on life, one's ethical values. There is really nothing new here. God has already told the people what is good. Their fascination with ceremony and sacrifices may actually hide a reluctance to really come to terms with what they already know, what is really, truly important. Ronald Hyman, a professor of Rutgers University in New Jersey, suggested that this triplet's conciseness and its emphasis on only three verbs, doing, loving, walking, connected to these three moral values, justice, mercy, and humility, make it comprehensible and easy to remember. The series of three pairs of a verb tied to a moral value creates an appealing poetic rhythm. Together, they constitute a series that is a moral guidance for behavior among humans, a goal worth striving for. So how will acting justly look like in your profession? Honestly, I cannot answer this question for you. I'm not a doctor of dental science and nor a doctor of pharmacy. You are the experts. You need to figure out how you will implement the notion of doing acts of justice for individuals that you serve and heal, and how you will fight for justice so that uninsured and many more underinsured get drugs or root canals when they're in pain, and when they're in need of healing. You are called to ask yourself, how would the world in which you live look like if acts of justice are being done for the underdog and the marginal, for the poorest of the poor? How will I become the voice for the voiceless and the power for the powerless in the world in which there are still over 1.2 billion people who live in abject poverty? In which 22,000 children still die each day from poverty and from diseases that we can prevent with the drugs that are available, or from the health education that we know about. 3 million children die from malnutrition every year. Sometimes you will have one or two who will come to you and ask for help and just ponder in perplexity how they could pay for the health services that they need. And you will be faced with a decision how to act justly on a day-to-day level. But there will be many others who will never come face to face with you. And yet doing justice will mean that you need to advocate for them as well. Act justly, mishpat. Here has the sense of true religion. That is the ethical response to God that has a manifestation in social concern for the many less fortunate than us. To do justice means to tinker not with a few minor details, but to raise one's voice in order to transform the status quo, rewriting its policies and empowering victims. So what is the first GLO? What does God actually require? Mishpat, Hebrew word, justice in the Bible, which is not colorless word, but is defined again and again. Look, Psalm 82. Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and destitute. Martha Moore-Kish of Columbia Theological Seminary put it this way: God calls us back to justice, I quote, which means caring for the poor and needy, the widow and the orphan. Provide for your neighbor, says the Lord through Micah. Stop offering sacrifices to me and start offering sustenance to those who need it most. Please notice the prophet does not say admire justice. The prophet does not say, well, let's have an intellectual academic discussion about the justice. But he says act justly. The Bible is interested in the deeds, in the place where the rubber actually interacts with the road, in our practices, and not only in our theory. Let us not belittle deeds and practices which we employ in our faith life. Our personal and professional lives are supposed to include a resolute resistance to the crying injustices in the world. So again I ask, how would Loma Linda's motto of making man whole look like not only here in SoCal, but around the world as we implement God's required acts of justice? It is not enough to wish for justice or to complain because it is lacking. This is a dynamic concept that calls on God's people to work for fairness and equality for all. Let me tell you a story. I read a story some time ago, long time ago, while I was still working in England, and it was still a story that continues coming back to my mind regularly. The story was of a lady who came to a professional photographer seeking to get special portraits taken, photos of her in her best clothes. And so she came to this photographer and she said to him, I demand that these photos do me justice. The artist looked at her from several angles and then he looked again very carefully and said, ma'am, you do not need as much justice as you need grace. Frederick Buechner suggested that justice is itself not unmerciful. Justice also does not preclude mercy. It makes mercy possible. Justice is the pitch of the roof and the structure of the walls. Mercy is the patter of the rain on the roof and the life sheltered by the walls. Buchner said, justice is the grammar of things. Mercy is the poetry of things. And this connection brings us to this second requirement, which says love mercy. When in healthcare ethics we talk about beneficence and non-maleficence, we think about the loving ways to treat patients. But to love patients is one thing, and to love mercy or love kindness is a totally different thing. Please note that here love is not a noun, it is actually a verb. We are not aiming at love, but we are loving kindness and mercy. The object of love in Micah's case is to pursue hesed, another rich Hebrew term with deep and varied meaning that can hardly be conveyed by any one single English word. It is usually rendered as faithfulness or loyalty or charity, merciful treatment of others, or kindness to those who are in relationship with us. Hesed is a particularly interesting word as it is used in Jewish scriptures about parties that are connected together. They are bound together with a definite bond. It carries these overtones of loyalty. So the strangers are not and cannot be in that relationship bond that expresses itself in loving kindness. It has to do with love, loyalty, faithfulness, and can be used to describe the key elements of relationship. Merciful kindness is fundamentally a relational term. This is the way we are supposed to treat each other in relationships. Strangers do not love hesed because they lack the relational ties with others from which it arises. All of you will have an ample opportunity in your professional relationships, in clinics, and with your regular patients at the chair side and the counter side to develop such relationships. Others will practice these in addition to their professional relationship in their personal and family ties. We are not asked to exercise such kindness only, but really to love it. You see, being merciful, in other words, is not a burden for the follower of God, but it is a matter of appreciating that quality and appropriating as well as continuing to cultivate it. In the 17th century, Stephen Charnock explained it beautifully. He said, I quote, "The justice and mercy of God are united in a joint applause. An eternal marriage is made between mercy and justice. Both shake hands and not only acquiesce but rejoice, both pleased and both gratified." We come at last to the third part of this profound threefold guide to moral life that God desires. And we notice that the first two parts deal with human-to-human relationships, and the last part reflects the human-to-divine relationship. As we mortals are requested to walk humbly with our God. Walking is a metaphor for a life's journey. Being on the way is more important than sometimes arriving. Christians are followers of the way. And often we are told that there are two possible paths: the wider that lead astray or even to death, and the narrower that yields life. Micah's passage summons us to the path of justice and the path of kindness. So how are we to walk on that journey? Humbly is the right answer, but it has been misrepresented often with people over the centuries that suggested certain growling, self-abasement through fraudulent piety. Nothing, however, could be further from the intent here in Micah. Walking humbly is opposite to walking proudly and pompously or strutting. Proverbs 30:28-31 illustrates that such macho images of self-exhibit and self-importance with strutters. It's like a lion, it's like a rooster, it's a he-goat, a king. Walter Brueggemann writes about this posturing in this following way. I quote, "As we have seen recently with so many self-righteous politicians and ministers, such a strutting way often leads to embarrassment. Such prideful strutting bespeaks arrogance, self-sufficiency, autonomy, the need to occupy the center stage, the sense that I am the only one on the set." End of quote. Walking humbly is to pay attention to the other, to recognize that on the journey there are others who inescapably walk with us, and ultimately we walk with our God. The authentic humility pays attention to being in the presence of God, who in the first place practices restorative justice and steadfast kindness. The God who saves and feeds and reconciles and heals and forgives and transforms. Pride of the one who struts depends on self-enhancement and self-congratulations, which lead to narcissism. Walking with your own ego is the dreariest and ugliest kind of walk that leads to ultimate alienation. Remember that. Notice that God that we walk humbly with is called your God. What do you know about God? It begs the question if you know what God is really like, and if you're going somewhere rather than aimlessly and passively standing still. This companionship and developing friendship will inform you about your attitude to your God, the God that you are in relationship with. God that does justice, that loves mercy. Jesus, in his famous speech on the Mount of Blessings, the first one, reiterates Micah's message in Matthew 5, 6-8. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be filled. Blessed are those who are merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Let me conclude. Loma Linda University's board chairman, Dr. Lowell Cooper, tells a story in an article entitled "Doing Justice, Loving Mercy" of a woman in her mid-30s who arrived at the departure gate for her flight. And she was early, and she had time to relax and to read her book. Moments passed, and she suddenly leaped to her feet, turned to the person sitting near her, and exclaimed, "I left my phone in the car." She looked at her watch, threw her book and jacket on the chair, and cried, "I'll be back," and headed down the corridor. Dr. Cooper writes, "Determination of an Olympic athlete was on her face, though her body lacked Olympic athlete fitness." Through the corridor, past security and check-in counters, out the door, across the road, and down the walk to the parkway lot, she reached her car, grabbed the phone, slammed the door, and began the return journey. Out of breath, she arrived at the security line, the place where one experiences nowadays eternity in the present. After what seemed like a century, she made it through security and raced slowly now for the departure gate. Other passengers had already boarded. Without breaking stride, she grabbed her coat, presented her boarding pass, and headed on to the plane. Clutching her phone in her hand, she made it just in time. Phone was here, but she had forgotten her book on the chair. Under the stress for thinking about one important thing, say in your case, to master to be health care providers, and concentrating your attention on one thing that is there, a danger of overlooking the other important aspects of God and what He might want from me and you. Is it possible that our single-minded thinking about professional attainment might lead to an overriding attention on one aspect and the unintentional neglect of the other? I hope we can get the phone and not forget the book in the departure gate. As you depart into your new life with degrees that you have grabbed and attained, as you are finally reaching out of breath your boarding gate, completing all the needed PLOs and ILOs. Please do not neglect the GLO from Micah 6:8. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly into the plane that will take you to the new heights of your life as you serve the hurting world. Amen.